Let this video serve as your one-stop shop for getting into the Fate franchise, with tips on how to start, as well as understanding some of the underlying lore that makes experiencing any part of the series much easier. Welcome back to Otaku Daikun. Dai here. First off, let me say that my YouTube channel already has a ton of videos explaining the lore of this franchise, but none of them have been exclusively designed for newcomers. And while other channels have guides, I feel it's high time I provide my own. The first section of this guide will talk about Fate's various releases, giving you an understanding of how to start and navigate the franchise. The second will be a hyper-basic, yet comprehensive lore of the franchise that spoils just a bit in favor of making it much easier to understand. Feel free to watch just the first section if you don't want spoilers, but I must admit, I wish I had this knowledge going in. Overall, the Fate franchise is a series of works consisting of sequels, parodies, prequels, and spin-offs of the original 2004 visual novel Fate Stay Night. They all tell stories about masters and servants competing in what's called the Holy Grail War, each with their own twists on the formula. While it makes most sense to start with Fate Stay Night, you can technically jump into any of the other works if you prefer. What I've learned is that no matter where you start, you'll wind up with questions that get answered by experiencing other parts of the series. There are pros and cons to each work, and if you really enjoy them, you'll eventually see them all. The other thing to understand is that every work in the franchise is canon, because each one is its own alternate reality. It's a multiverse, after all, just like you can see with Marvel Comics. You could read the Iron Man comics, then watch the movies, and even though they have their own continuity, each one is valid relative to its own timeline. Sometimes artists will reboot a story, taking it in a completely different direction. Rather than saying one is more canon than the other, it's easiest to just acknowledge that there are different versions of any given story. This makes perfect sense for Fate, considering it started as a visual novel with branching narratives and various endings. So yeah, it's all canon, with each narrative taking place on a different timeline. So, even if you can start practically anywhere, I'll admit that it's probably easiest to start with the main Stay Night timeline, which consists of Fate Zero, Fate Stay Night, and Fate Hollow Ataraxia. Purists will obviously recommend you start with the visual novel, and for good reason. It's the original vision for the story, with by far the most amount of detail. No matter how brilliant the anime adaptations are, they don't cover every relevant detail you'll get by starting at the source. There are two problems with this method, though. First, the visual novel is incredibly long, and not necessarily paced to keep you in the action. There are tons of slice-of-life moments in there that may unintentionally turn off newcomers. That, and to this day, the visual novel still doesn't have an official English release, which means you're going to be sailing the high seas. Still, it's not that hard to obtain. The current version of the visual novel, Rialta Nua for Windows, is actually no longer on sale even in Japan, so there's literally no way to officially purchase it even if you wanted to. I've got info on how to get it in the video description. The other thing you'll need is the English patch hosted on the Type Moon forum Beast's Lair. It's called the Ultimate Edition, and can also be found in the description. This is most certainly the definitive way to experience Fate Stay Night, as it combines the adult content from the original release with the updated content from the Rialta Nua version, such as the highly coveted Last Episode, which is an epilogue to Saber's route. Now, not everyone's going to want or be able to go that far. It's a large time investment, and some of you lack the opportunity to sit at a Windows computer for hours on end. Thankfully, you can watch recordings of the entire thing here on YouTube. In particular, I have archived live streams of all of Fate Stay Night and Hollow Ataraxia you can watch, though it does have my commentary. There also exist no commentary runs that you can search out. Obviously, this is the purest way to get started, but truthfully, visual novels just aren't everyone's cup of tea. Even though Fate Stay Night is especially well made, with plenty of action and movement, it can't possibly stand up to some of the amazing animation that's been released since then. Because of this, I think starting with the anime is just as valid. That said, visual novels and anime often don't mix as well because of structure. The visual novel has 3 different plot routes, each with different endings and a slew of deaths. There's no way to pack all of that information into a single anime, but we're in a rather glorious time because all 3 plot routes have been more or less animated as standalone releases. If you want to experience Saber's route, also called the Fate route, you can do so by watching the 2006 anime by Studio Dean. It's not the best adaptation, as it tries to cram in parts of the other routes into the story, but it does hit the important story beats. The second route, Unlimited Blade Works, was adapted into a series by Ufotable. This is a gorgeous anime that really does the visual novel justice. In fact, it's in part thanks to Ufotable that Fate is as popular as it is today. There also exists a theatrical adaptation of this route by Studio Dean, and while it's fun to watch, it really fails at trying to condense hours of narrative into a single movie. At this point, all it's good for is serving as a highlight reel of the route's fight scenes, but ever since Ufotable did such a great job on their adaptation, you can likely skip the Unlimited Blade Works movie altogether. As for the final route, Heaven's Feel, that just got animated by Ufotable in the form of a movie trilogy. At the time of me writing this video, the final film has been out in Japan for some time and is getting theater screenings in English during November. The one piece of the visual novel you'll be missing is the Rialta Nua last episode, which has yet to be released in an animated form. Well, scratch that actually. Turns out Ufotable did animate this epilogue, but right now it can only be watched by visiting Type Moon's museum in Japan. Honestly, I'd sacrifice a nut to get my hands on that. Anyway, the one thing I want to clarify is that when I refer to plot routes, I'm referring to different ways the Fifth Holy Grail War could have gone down. They all start from the same point, but branch off to tell completely different stories. So right from the beginning, there never was just one story called Fate Stay Night, and none of the game's plot routes are considered to be the canon ending. Again, they're all valid according to their own timelines. I get a lot of questions from people who watch only one of the anime and are confused when what they remember doesn't match what I'm talking about in one of my lores. The reason is that there are different versions of the story depending on which route you take. This is made abundantly clear in the visual novel sequel, Fate Hollow Ataraxia, which is technically a sequel to all three routes combined. As of right now, Hollow Ataraxia only exists as a visual novel. You can find links to it, as well as English voice and decensor patches in the description, because again, this never got an official English release. If you'd prefer, I also streamed the entire novel for you to watch on my channel. Admittedly, that stuff's all a tad complicated, and one of the reasons Fate really got popular was when Ufotable animated the light novel Fate Zero, which serves as the prequel to Fate Stay Night. Some purists don't recommend starting with this one because it spoils parts of Stay Night, but I personally feel it's a fantastic way to start the franchise. Unlike the other works, Zero is a single narrative that can be lovingly experienced in its light novel form or via fantastic manga and anime adaptations. There are pros and cons to starting here too, though. While it does give away some spoilers for Stay Night, I also feel like it provides proper context and build-up that actually make parts of Stay Night even better. Experiencing both Stay Night and Zero, either through anime or novel, will give you a solid foundation to easily jump anywhere in the franchise. So let me just give a brief rundown of what those works are. Let's start with Carnival Phantasm. This one's a parody anime with comedic skits based on both the Fate and Tsukihime series. It's totally fine to watch if you haven't read Tsukihime, since most of it is still Fate-oriented. There's no major story to worry about, but the jokes won't land if you aren't aware of Stay Night. While Hollow Ataraxia has yet to be adapted, the closest thing we do have is the anime and manga Emiya-san Shi no Kyo no Gohan, or Today's Menu for the Emiya family. It's a cute slice of life that, like Hollow Ataraxia, happens after Stay Night as though all the routes combined into one. Again, it doesn't tell any huge narrative, but it helps to understand Stay Night so you can understand what the characters went through and how nice it is to see them happy together. Placed between Stay Night and Zero is the anime El Malloy Case Files. It follows what happens to Waver, a character from Zero, after the Fourth Holy Grail War. Technically, El Malloy Case Files is a series of 10 light novels, many of which you can find fan translations of. The anime only adapts one of these volumes, so you'll have to do some reading to get the full story. More serious is the spin-off Fate Apocrypha. It's an alternate timeline that branches off from the one in Stay Night, where earlier on, events deviate so that the Fourth Holy Grail War never happens. Instead, there's a Great Holy Grail War between two factions of masters and servants. It's a light novel that also has an anime adaptation. I personally love the anime and feel it does a solid job covering the story, even with some minor differences. Another major spin-off is Fate Collide Liner Prisma Ilia. It's based around one of the central characters, Ilia, getting her own entirely different narrative. It's another alternate reality, where the Grail War technically never happens, and Ilia instead becomes a magical girl to stop malicious servants manifesting from cards. While kinda silly, this story has gotten rather complex, with a prequel that takes itself much more seriously. Most of the story has been animated, including the prequel movie, Oath Under Snow, but the manga it's based on is still being written. The same goes for Fate Extra. It's a much crazier spin-off in which the Holy Grail War takes place inside a computer on the moon. Originally, it was a game on the PlayStation Portable that's never been ported, but it's now being remade for modern platforms. It had a sequel on the PSP called Fate Extra CCC, which essentially added new plot routes to the original Extra game. The series continued in the form of a Muso game, Fate Extella, and its sequel, Fate Extella Link. While you can play the original Extra and the two Muso games in English, CCC never got translated. The only solution English speakers have to experience it is to watch a translation of it on YouTube, but even then it only covers one of the game's various routes. As if to make things even more complicated, CCC has a spin-off manga called Foxtail that is still being published. As a devilish cherry on top, Nasu, the series creator, put out an anime called Fate Extra Last Encore, which isn't a straight-up adaptation of the original Extra, but rather a complicated reboot of sorts that only makes sense if you've already played the first game. I'd like to say that Extra is by far the most intimidating of all the Fate works, because it all hinges upon you playing a game that had a limited release on a now defunct console. That said, there's lots to love about it, and I doubt you'll regret the experience. Just do not start with Last Encore. The further we go, the more obscure things get. 3 of the harder-to-access works in the franchise are Fate Prototype, Fate Strange Fake, and Fate Requiem. Strange Fake and Requiem are both ongoing light novels in Japan, with limited English fan translations. Like Apocrypha, they tell the story of Grail Wars that have vastly different rules and separate realities. I personally feel like trying to read these should be a last resort, unless you can actually read Japanese, in which case I hear they're very good. Prototype is quite bizarre. Basically, Type Moon had a very different version of what Fate Stay Night would look like during development. A lot of the characters had different designs, and it took place in a different location. Because of this, Type Moon, the company making all these works, decided to release their vision for Prototype in the form of a big trailer, showing us what could have been. A lot of fans liked it, and from that curiosity came Fate Prototype Fragments of Sky Silver, a light novel that serves as the prequel to a story that technically has never been fully told. Again, to experience this, you'll need to scour the internet for fan translations. It's worth noting that most of these works have manga adaptations as well. They're fantastic, sometimes adding in details that were too spicy to be animated. All of these different works more or less exist according to separate universes, yet one work pays homage to all of them. Fate Grand Order, by far the most prolific and profitable piece of the franchise, tells a story about mages going to alternate times and timelines, meeting an enormous ensemble of servants in an effort to save all of humanity. It has its own story, which is itself a branch off of the main Stay Night timeline, but it also incorporates collaboration events from other works, uniting them into a single story. While the mobile game has been released in English, and is still coming out to this day, it can't be played outside of Japan, North America, or other select countries. That said, if you want to experience the story, I've also been live streaming every major story event in the game, so if you can't play it, you can at least watch it. FGO, being free to play with gacha elements, has become extremely popular, such that select parts of the story have been adapted into anime and manga. The beginning section of the story was animated into Fate Grand Order, First Order. One of the more popular segments, Camelot, is being turned into a set of animated movies, while the Babylonia arc has an entire series to itself. In addition to some OVAs, there's also an adaptation of the Solomon finale in the works. Most of these you really shouldn't watch unless you're familiar with the game already, because they take place rather deep into the narrative. That said, FGO is the main attraction for the franchise now, and odds are you'll be experiencing it in some form sooner or later. With all of that broken down, I'm going to give my personal recommendation for how to experience the Fate series. It's by no means definitive, and I'm sure some people will disagree with me, but this method is meant to be the easiest and most accessible. To start off, watch either Fate Zero or the Unlimited Blade Works anime, not the movie. These two anime are so well made that they're guaranteed to excite you. If you don't enjoy these, you're not likely going to enjoy the rest of the franchise. Whichever one you start with, go ahead and follow up with the other. If you're still interested in knowing what happens in Saber or Sakura's routes, you can then watch the 2006 anime and the Heaven's Feel movies, or dive full-on into the visual novel. If by now you've fallen in love with the characters and want to see more, definitely check out Hollow Ataraxia, Carnival Phantasm, and today's menu for the Emiya family. If you really enjoy Fate's portrayal of Magecraft, as well as Waver, proceed to watch El Malloy Case Files or read its light novels. If you want to see Elia in a more optimistic light, or if you have a strong attachment to Shiro, go ahead and watch Collide Liner Prisma Elia, and of course Oath Under Snow. A lot of those are optional. If you've at least seen Zero and Unlimited Blade Works, you're free to branch into whatever you wish, including Fate Grand Order. If you get far enough into the game, go ahead and watch First Order and Babylonia because they're awesome. You'll likely run into references of the other Fate franchises, so if you want a better understanding, go ahead and watch Apocrypha, and if you can get your hands on them, play Fate Extra, Extella, and Extella Link. Now, if you've gotten this far, chances are you're no longer in need of a video like this. You're probably invested enough in the franchise that you'll seek out those more obscure works like Fate Extra CCC, Foxtail, Prototype, Requiem, and Strange Fake all on your own. If you're really invested, you'll be impatient waiting for FGO to release its content in English, and you'll be on the front lines experiencing the Japanese release as it comes out. And that's my guide to the various Fate works themselves. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, help me beat the algorithm by liking, commenting, and sharing the video, subscribing to Otaku Daikun, and, most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of my anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content. If you want to support me directly, there are now 3 ways that all provide the same benefits. You can click Join here on YouTube, or join Patreon or Subscribestar for access to exclusive vids and early access. As always, celebrate your fandom.